Hey, fantastic. Okay, so just for a quick summary. So again, I'm going to just be explaining what's on the slide in English. So no worries to need any kind of translation. You can read if you want French. You can listen if you want English. So we're going to go over one very important update that's not exactly related to the conference, but ties into it, which is feedback from the national meeting that was held with Correctional Services Canada and AA the 5th of September. We'll go through the value of conferences, an introduction to the bridging of the gap, key takeaways, differences between Canada and the US, and the vision for our area. So la prochaine. Yeah. Cool. So yes, some very, very big things happened right before I left. So I was privileged to be invited to a meeting between the Government of Canada, the Corrections Department, of course, and AA. This was put together by the Area Service Office, or the big one, New York. And it was probably one of the most beautiful 2-hour meetings I've ever been on in my time on this planet. Even in service, of course, it was beautiful, but just it extends beyond that. Um, a lot of the contact between the government institution for corrections and AA was lost in the midst of the pandemic. So the goal of this meeting was the first step of getting our communication back to where it used to be, enhancing networks and understanding the needs and the collaboration needs between AA and Corrections Canada. So now the biggest thing here, because we do live in Quebec, not everything can be taken at face value that is discussed on a federal level. So I have already reached out to the coordinator of this event and our representative at the New York office to get in contact with the Correctional Services Canada representative that's in Quebec, because we will have far more provincial obstacles than the rest of Canada, just with some of Quebec's implement like laws and everything. So that's definitely next step, but it's a very, very monumental moment, the fact that this meeting took place in and of itself. So they are listening, and they do want us to be able to extend our reach into the detention centers as well. Next slide, please. Yes, so what is the importance of the conference? So one of the main things that I learned this last weekend, well, I mean, I learned a lot. So the importance of the conference is one, networking, right? So we get to meet members from across all of North America, with a second common purpose, right? Our primary purpose is to help alcoholics recover from alcoholism. At these conferences, the ones that at least I have been exposed to, the second primary purpose, is to help people who are in detention centers and are suffering alcoholics find the rooms of sobriety. And it is actually wow, direct translation much. It is thanks to last year's National Corrections Conference that I attended in Chicago that I was able to network with those in New York who were putting this meeting with Corrections Canada together. And it's because of that that I was privy to the invite. So it really, really does help. This past meeting, or this past conference, I was able, or myself and Jeff were able to meet people from the future host district, from Montana, and from all Alberta, Canada as well, all who have very strong Bridging the Gap programs, and they shared all their experience and information with us. So that last thing is supposed to say knowledge sharing, or partage d'information, but it looks like information got cut off. It's transferring from Google to PowerPoint. So the shared experience, another thing that we have in common at these conferences, is every area representative there, right, is at a different point of implementing the practices of bridging the gap. And we're able to learn from people's successes and failures. So I'll go a bit more into common success methods, common fail safes that we learned this past weekend, but that's a huge advantage to kind of know what works and know what doesn't when we're looking to implement this in our area. And then the knowledge sharing, right? So the ability to sit down with members from, again, all across the country, like I mentioned, they're so willing to share what they have learned with us. And that comes in the form of, documentation, forms, flyers, uh, little contact cards, everything that they have created to inspire and help us get to where we want to be in terms of our Bridging the Gap initiatives. So next slide, please. Just a few pictures of the conference. Trust me, there are more photos to come. So the Sheraton's, the hotel, you can see the setup, and I was very, very popular for my little friend Garrett, who held my coffee. Alrighty, next slide. Perfect. So what is Bridging the Gap? What does it mean? So this quote is directly from one of our new friends from Montana's Bridging the Gap manual, and I couldn't even word it any better. So I just copy pasted it and quoted it, credited it. So assisting the newcomer aids the contact's own sobriety and demonstrates AA's singleness of purpose. The contact's primary purpose is to introduce the newcomer to AA meetings in the newcomer's home. So it goes and shows both sides, right? It's not just something that we're benefiting the newcomer. I mean, this is common knowledge, right? It's the sponsor and the sponsee relationship is very deep and it's intense. And this is a little bit less intense because you're not meant to be taking them on as a sponsee from the get-go. You're just facilitating that transition, right? So the whole goal of it is to facilitate a member's re-entry or entry rather into the program after being released from rather a detention center or a treatment facility. So I put a little bridge here because we're talking about bridging some gaps. So at one side of the bridge, you have the member who was just released out of a center, which should be noted is a very controlled environment, right? For those of us who have been in rehab or who have been behind walls, we know that that's a very controlled environment. We don't have access to what we have in day-to-day life. The bridge is really the temporary contact, right? So the temporary contact, in a sense, lies down so the person can walk over safely to the programs, to the rooms, to the meetings, and helps them get there safely. I know, speaking just for myself, once I got out of rehab, that controlled environment, going to the chaos of everyday life, it was really easy for my mind to wander and to lose focus on what maybe I was really set on doing when I was in rehab. And having that person who will go to a couple meetings with you or who will at least introduce you to meetings in your area really, really helps and increases the rate of at least getting to that first meeting. And which in turn, we know you get to one meeting, your success can happen if you do the same thing every single day and you take it a day at a time. So next slide, please. Yes, c'est parfait. Donc, le début. Merci. Donc, il y a une demande, there's a request, right, for a correspondence. Somebody is rather getting out of a jail or getting out of a treatment center, and their request comes in for needing a temporary contact. So this is where the contribution of the treatment facilities and the correction facilities come in. So this is communicating directly with the professionals, or at the very least having an open channel of communication so that you can get more details around when their release is going to be, the area to which they will be released. This will obviously all facilitate getting that person to a meeting and being able to hook them up, link them with someone, a temporary contact who is in their area as well. Yeah. So this is a model that was shown to us, by the way. It's not necessarily the only process, but I figured it was nice to have a process kind of visualized. So next you have the email that goes to the Bridging the Gap email box, that would kind of take the requester, so the new member, and link them up with a temporary contact in their area, which comes to the contribution of the region. So this goes, and somebody who is getting released from, let's say they're getting released from area they're in Area 87, but they're being released into Area 88, right? Well, we can contact people from Area 88 who can contact the specific district so that we can get somebody in their area that is going to be ready to have received them when they get there, rather than relying on everyone in Area 87 to cover all 4 districts that make up Quebec. And then they get linked with a temporary contact, right? So it's so much fun. They have 3 attempts. So once you get linked with a newly released member, I guess it's asked that you try 3 separate times to call them. Of course, if you get them on the first shot, that's amazing. But if, I'm sure, I know it happens more often than not that the first time they don't pick up, right? We do it 3 times, at which point you say no answer, and you would be given another temporary or another newcomer if there was the need. But assuming everything goes well and you get to a meeting with them, the bridging is complete. And there's one more step. It's not bad. There's one more step that happens right after the bridging is complete, and I love it. And this is establishing a database. So one of the biggest things or takeaways that I had from this weekend as a data nerd is, and again, this is not going and infringing on anonymity, because it will be done solely based on almost like binary data information, right? So did they answer? Yes or no? Did they get to a meeting? Yes or no? That's it. If the temporary contact chooses to give keep in contact with the Bridging the Gap committee and let them know how things are going, or that they've seen them, go through their first month, that's fantastic. But at the base, what the Bridging the Gap focuses on is getting to that first meeting. It doesn't focus on long-term success. It's focused on the success of just bridging that gap, not the gap from in addiction to long-term sobriety. So that's super important to make sure that we have an evaluative system so that we're able to say, okay, is something that we're not doing working, or is something we are doing not working, and we can change the way we're going about things. Next slide. So just a quick glance, you guys can look at this more in depth afterwards, but every little pin on the map is where one committee was from this year. So we had about close to 30, just under 30 people, just under 30 districts represented. And if you go to the next slide, because I'm a data nerd, right? I have a little bit of a breakdown. So 86% of the committees or of the regions that were present had an established, new, or were in the process of restarting their Bridging the Gap committee. So that's 86%. The other 14% had no committee established just yet, but we're obviously there to learn. Out of the committees there, 96% had a corrections committee and 69% had a reported treatment facilities committee. And the number one problem that was brought up throughout the weekend in the scope of Bridging the Gap was the problems linked to the spirit of rotation, simply because to create a program so in-depth and so convoluted with as little time as 2 years, you don't have enough time to establish it properly, have it implemented at every level it needs to be, inter-district, inter-area, and then with the professionals, and then pass it on. So that's just one of the takeaways as well. Next slide. So obstacles that we ran into, both in here and in the US. So they have a lot of restrictions with confidentiality, though it's slightly easier because if the the confined member or those in treatment give them consent to have their information, it's just getting it from the professionals that could be more difficult. But in Canada, there's a second level of clearance that I had learned about, and it is significantly more difficult to pass, especially for those in recovery, because it does require like a credit check. You have to have a good credit score to be able to have access to private information, such as the release date. So to be determined, I will have to come back on that piece because when I have that meeting with the Quebec coordinate for Corrections Canada, hopefully we'll have more insight. Next slide. And here's the vision for us. So step one is we have to start thinking about creating our own Bridging the Gap committee. We have had this conference happen for multiple years. People have gone, people have felt the inspiration. I know previous corrections coordinator went and was so inspired, but it's very difficult to materialize an actual committee, especially if we are still differentiating treatment centers and correctional facilities. So the goal being to have one independent committee serving as perhaps a subcommittee of one of the two that really handles the temporary contacts and bridging the gap efforts. Purpose being to work with corrections, work with treatments to minimize the amount of duplicated efforts, right? So if treatments has 15 contacts currently and corrections has 5, we come together, maybe we have 20 people, right? And then we minimize the number of people we ask over and over again to be a temporary contact. Secondly is again to bridge the gaps within. So to streamline our efforts between treatments and corrections to achieve this common goal and making the transition out of a facility into a reality. And the last step is to create a database, right? To track who we have to rely on in terms of temporary contacts. What are the processes? There's a bunch already formatted of the requirements and the guides for this. So this is just a surface level look. So it's not all involved and all explained right here. So don't get too crazy because I have all the information to back it up in other documents. Next slide. This is just obviously when you're in Texas, right? And you have some time before your next flight, you're gonna go and explore. And everything is bigger in Texas. Turns out I really suit cowboy hats. Didn't realize. And we found rock bottom again. So that's a lot of fun. And if you go to the last slide, I'll just read you guys a quote that we heard this weekend. Yeah. So I translated it from English and I actually was able to make it work in French. So I'll read it in English. We do our best, God does the rest. And in French, nous faisons de notre mieux, Dieu fait ce qu'il peut. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much.